Quote, Trotsky, who as Commissar of Foreign Affairs represented the Soviet government, felt compelled to turn them down, proclaiming a new policy. Here's his policy. Get this. You think Trotsky is a great guy? You think he was even a reasonable guy? Listen to his policy. No war, no peace. So we're not going to be peaceful with you. We're not going to sign a peace treaty, but we're not going to fight you anymore. How do you like that? Oh yeah? We're not going to fight you. How do you like that? Guess what the Germans did? According to anarchists and utopian thinkers, the Germans would sit down and go, he doesn't want to fight me. What can I do? But in reality, a thug doesn't care what you want. So, the Germans, quote, proceeded to advance, occupying more territory and seizing an enormous amount of military material. Trotsky says, we're not going to fight you. The Germans say, well, we'll take this, this, and this, and this, and this. Brilliant. Brilliant. Now, Trotsky and these other people in the government just thought we cannot accept the German demands. Quote, only Lenin's authority and determination swung the balance in favor of the humiliating peace. By sacrificing much else, Lenin in all probability saved communist rule in Russia, for the young Soviet government was in no position whatsoever to fight Germany. So it ended up that the peace terms Trotsky refused were accepted by Lenin's say-so. It was the Soviet-German Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed March 3, 1918. Oh, and here's some statistics on what they lost. The peace conditions were disastrous to Russia. The Ukraine, Poland, Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia received their independence. Part of Transcaucasia was ceded to Turkey. Russia lost 26% of her population, 27% of her arable land, 32% of her average crops, 26% of her railway system, 33% of her manufacturing industries, and 75% of her iron industries, 75% of her coal fields, and besides that, Russia had to pay a large war indemnity. So they lose all that, 75% of some of their stuff, a third of this, third of that, and had to pay money to the Germans. Quote, only the ultimate German defeat in the First World War prevented the Brest-Litovsk settlement from being definitive, and in particular made it possible for the Soviet government to reclaim the Ukraine. So, now the Soviets have power. They've made peace with the Germans, they've provided that. Lenin allows peasants to seize land. The government assigns control over factories to workers' committees. And the government nationalized all banks, confiscating private accounts. So if you had money in the bank, tough beans. Of course, no one has money in the banks except for the selfish, greedy bourgeoisie, right? Foreign trade became a state monopoly, and a special commissariat was created to handle it. In December 1917, the existing judicial system was declared abolished. The new revolutionary tribunals and people's courts were to be guided by the socialist legal consciousness. Titles and ranks disappeared. Authorities gradually assumed control over the scarce housing and other material aspects of life. Remember, they're into total equality. Everyone's equal. Everyone from the president to the lowest sweeper on the street should all get the same. Ideally, of course, they stretch that out a bit, but ideally they think everyone should be completely equal, live in the same type of houses and everything. Very, very weird. As early as December of 1917, the government established the Extraordinary Commission to combat counter-revolution, sabotage, and speculation. And if you put all that together, an acronym is called the Cheka, headed by Felix Dzerzhinsky. From that time on, the political police became a fundamental reality of Soviet life. Now, interestingly, they actually used a lot of the members of the Tsarist government to run the new Soviet secret police, army, the military during the war, and even the bureaucracy of the government itself. So, it's kind of like the old Tsarist shirts were just being shed and red shirts were replacing them overnight, and no real change. In fact, the power now was riveted on tighter. People had less freedom. Reality was much more brutal than it was under the czars. Eventually, there's this breather spell we're going to talk about called the NEP, and this part where the Soviets are allowed, where the citizens are supposedly allowed to confiscate land and stuff, and all that sounds lovely and flowery, but eventually they have to come back to reality and do something. But anyways, the Cheka was established as early as 1917. Again, evidence that Lenin was not a nice guy. Lenin was as bad as you please, and if he would have stayed in power in the revolution instead of Stalin, here you have the secret police 8 years before Lenin croaked. You have the secret police established. So Stalin was bad, but Lenin taught Stalin pretty much everything he knew, probably. Now, let's talk for a second about war communism and what was going on when the Civil War proper begins. The nationalization, quote, the nationalization of industry, which began shortly after the revolution, was extended in June to cite the listing of everything the state appropriated, quote, the mining, metallurgical, textile, electrical, timber, tobacco, resin, glass, and pottery, leather, and cement industries, all steam-driven mills, local utilities, private railways, together with a few minor industries. All that was nationalized. Mining, metallurgical, textile, electrical, timber, tobacco, resin, glass, pottery, leather, cement, anything steam-driven, any local industry, private railways, and minor industries. Quote, eventually industry disappeared almost entirely. Compulsory labor was introduced. Private trade was gradually suppressed to be replaced by rationing and by government distribution of food and other necessities of life. Compulsory labor was introduced. So early on it was all about freedom and bread, but it didn't take very long, right? In 1918, during 1918, very shortly after they took power, they begin compulsory labor. That's conscription into the military, except not even for defense of the country, just to make a road or something. It's conscription. And remember, the Soviets before were saying everybody should elect their leaders in the army and stuff, and now they're treating civilian life the way the old military treated military life. And this is very early on in the revolution. This isn't Stalin's corruption. This is when Lenin's in power. So the government took over the distribution of food and other necessities of life. On February 19th, 1918, the nationalization of land was proclaimed. All land became state property, to be used only by those who would cultivate it themselves. All land would become state property. That means that the peasants who seized land for themselves just lost it. So all those promises of land-bred freedom, take away the land of the expropriators and stuff, all that's out now. Now the state tells you where to work, and you work on the land they tell you to work on. And it's not your land. You give all of your produce to the state, and they give you back what you need to survive. It starts very early. It didn't take Stalin to corrupt it. So the government says all the land is ours. We need the produce from the land. We need all the crops and stuff. Thank you very much. Oh, you think you grew this crop? Well, you grew it on our land, and it's our crop now. That didn't set well with the peasants. And with hunger setting in, the Soviet government, quote, under the pressure of the Civil War and of the desperate need to obtain food for the Red Army and the urban population, authorities finally decreed a food levy, in effect ordering the peasants to turn in their entire produce, except for a minimal amount to be retained for their own sustenance and for sowing. As the peasants resisted, forcible requisitioning and repression became common. So, real early, this is 1918, they start expropriating food and arresting and shooting people who won't give them their food. And any little amount, it says here that they could keep enough for their own consumption and for sowing in the next spring or whatever. But that's not true in the actual, let's see, I have here, Harvest of Sorrow